welcome to the Sanctuary, a safe space to speak from the heart. I'm your host, Israel, and my guest today is writer, Kinkster, super awesome human being, Lila Quinn. Thanks for coming to the Sanctuary today.
Of course, it's my pleasure to be here.
Mm. I gotta say, the thing that stood out for me was the writing. And then in one of your writings, found out that, oh, well, you actually went to school for it. I'm like, okay. So let's start with that. Why did you decide to go get your graduate degree in creative writing?
Yes, yeah. So I have my MFA in creative writing with a specialty in poetry, of all things, which growing up in a small town in Missouri, I had no idea this was a thing. I didn't know that there was like a literary world I could plug into, much less go to school for. So I went to college at a small liberal arts school in St. Louis, and there I met a couple of writers, but the person that I'm really thinking of is my mentor, David Kluhl, who's a fantastic poet. He unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, but we struck up like this really beautiful friendship, mentorship. He really took me under his wing. And I was like a really closed off, like scared kid. And I remember being in his introductory workshop, and it was like the first time that I had sat at a table with a group of people that I felt a connection with and like a kinship with. I just remember looking around and being like, oh my God, my tribe, where have you been? And it's like the school I went to is mostly a theater school. So there's just like a lot of really amazing artsy people. And like, it's a really, I call it like my own little Hogwarts. Like it really did feel magical. Just the space that had been created. The English and philosophy department were in the same building. So there was just like this energy. It was in this like renovated mansion. The campus is really weird in that way that it like had acquired like a bunch of like old historic houses in St. Louis and like put like classrooms and stuff in it. So there was like brick courtyards and like a foyer and chandeliers. It was so wild. And David, yeah, I just remember him asking me to stay after class one day, and I was just sure that I was in trouble, right? Like there was that, guilty conscience fraud syndrome because, everybody in the class were, they were farther along in their college years than me, and they were brilliant, and a lot of them had taken these classes before and just had a frame of reference that I didn't have. And so I thought for sure David was like kind of calling me aside to be like, I can see that you're struggling and like, maybe you should kind of rethink being in this class. And of course it was the opposite. He was wildly affirming and, just had like noticed that I was really connecting with poetry. And poetry was sort of on my radar prior to that, but not in a huge way, right? Like I knew of Poe and Dickinson, and like I think that's pretty much it. And so yeah, and then the next 3 years of my undergraduate, he just really helped me develop as a writer. At first, I was like very convinced I was a fiction writer, so I wrote like short stories and was just like had that whole dream of great American novel, et cetera, et cetera. And like I have gone to fiction again recently, but it wasn't until my senior year thesis where I had to select either doing a short collection of poems or a short story or an excerpt from a novel to submit as my undergraduate thesis. And like right up until like the last minute, I was like, I'm doing fiction. And like literally everybody in the department, like I had taken way more poetry classes. I was like so clearly a poet to everybody but me. And then finally I just sort of came to and was like, oh, right. Like I'm specializing in poetry and I'm submitting my thesis in poetry. And David, at that point was like, you should consider going to graduate school for this and you can get funded. Just apply to programs where you can get funded. And, so he put that on my radar. I knew I didn't want to go straight into graduate school. I had been a very like straight A student working multiple jobs, like really like hyper focused, like needing to be a high achiever. And for a couple of reasons, like, I just wanted to take a break. Like part of it was that I felt like a little existentially burned out. And part of it was like, I was just coming into myself as an artist and wanting to really take to heart something David would say, which is like, go experience as much life as you can that's going to make you a better writer.
Mm.
So, I wanted to go experience life. And I did that for a year. I had every intention of delaying grad school even longer, but the program that David was most interested in me applying to, where his mentor was teaching, he was like, you should definitely apply to Wisconsin. And Wisconsin does a interesting thing with their admissions with their MFA program. And that one year they accept fiction writers, and then the next year they accept poets, and they alternate like that.
Oh.
So that year that I was taking my gap year was a poetry year. And so if I didn't apply that year and then I applied to a bunch of other schools the following year, I was like really afraid I would never know about like whether or not I could get into Wisconsin, because it's a pretty exclusive and prestigious program. They only take 6 people a year.
Wow.
It's consistently rated as like one of the top creative writing programs, which is all like this, like I heard those words when I was like in this moment, but I didn't quite grasp like how precious it was to be able to go to this program until I got there.
Mm.
And like I was really it's funny because like this is such a story for me of like the moment of life that I was in. Like I was in this like relationship that was like not the healthiest, and then it was kind of falling apart, and I was like looking for an out. So I applied to Wisconsin thinking there's no way I'm going to get in. And then I got waitlisted, and I was like, okay, this is a weird limbo. And this is like, I'm debating on how forthright I want to be about this story, because I was involved in some like, vaguely nefarious things. Like it's funny to be in Colorado now. It's all weed related, so it's funny to be in Colorado now where it's like completely legal and okay. But in Missouri in 2012, it was very much not okay. So anyway, maybe we'll get into that later. But anyway, I got waitlisted and then denied. The class had filled up, and then like 2 weeks later, as I'm in this just like really dark place of like, who is this person I'm with? What is this relationship I'm in? What am I doing? Why did I study creative writing? Like, was this all a really bad set of life choices? And then I got an email, and the subject line, I'll never forget it. It was in all caps, and it said, "Do you still want to go here?" And so, of course, like I replied, I might have done my own like all caps electro shouting, like, "Yes, I do want to go here." So yeah, like that. And then I ended up in Wisconsin, and it was life-changing. I just, that feeling of like connecting with my tribe only amplified because, it's kind of calling out like from undergrad to graduate school. Like it's just, these are very serious writers. And these are people that sometimes like people in my class, like, these were 30-year-old working adults alongside people who had just finished college. So there was like, pretty, even within 6 people, like a fairly diverse spread of people that all loved poetry as much as I did, and were like dedicating their lives to it for at least a little bit of time while we were in the program. And being funded was a gift. And if anybody listens to this and is considering an MFA program, like don't pay for it. Like don't go unless you can secure funding, because it's ultimately a vanity degree and it's not going to get you super far. But if you love it, if you really love writing and you want a chance to be an artist and like grow amongst a community of people who like really invest in your development as an artist, like then go. It's my word of caution to people seeking graduate arts degrees. So yeah.
But I mean, you had a good time though, right?
Oh my God. I mean, yes, it's such an interesting mixed bag of like where I was in my personal life versus like what I was being given through the program. Where again, I was in this relationship and like, fuck it, safe place to speak from the heart. So I got involved with a teacher in my high school and then had proceeded to have like a 7-year relationship with that person. And so when I got to grad school was like the first moment that I was like, oh my God, like I have worth outside of this relationship, and this relationship is not invested in my well-being. It is not interested in seeing me grow. Like the more I grew as a human, the more this person resented me because they needed me to stay small, like the more I grew into my power, the more threatened they were. And then getting to Madison and like with the encouragement of some people that I met there, they were just like, you need to let it go and just like, and it was a messy breakup. It took forever for me to convince this person that I was serious about not wanting to be in relationship with them. So all of that was happening in my first semester. And at the same time, like going to class and like, you can walk into bookshelves and see my classmates and professors' books on the shelf,
Mm.
and like, again, like being this like rural kid, it was just like, frankly, it was a culture shock. I was just like, oh my God,
Ah.
these people are so much more sophisticated than me.
Wow.
Like they just know things I don't
Mm.
know. Like they're saying words I don't understand. And like I had a college degree. So so yeah, it was like this spiritual awakening, but like a lot of spiritual awakenings, it requires like this like dissolution of self and like everything, and like I was just like being like shattered on the one hand, and then on the other hand I was in this space that like, again, because of the kinds of people that are attracted to poetry and like, teaching poetry and fiction, like through sort of artistic mentorship, they were also like giving me tools and kind of like helping me plant seedlings of just like growing into the person that I was trying to become.
Mm.
And also developing as a writer, like the poems that I used to get into the program versus the poems I was writing at the end of the 2 years, wildly different.
Mm.
Like I started to just kind of be willing, like at first I was writing poems to be taken seriously and please other people and like mimicking writers that I loved. And as a young writer, that makes sense, right? Like
Mhm.
that's kind of how you begin, is like, you kind of imitate. And then with some guidance and also just again being in that moment of transformation, I started being willing to be risky and weird and like really playing with language. Like David would always say that poetry is the music of language. So I was really invested in like being musical in my work and
Mm.
like just kind of pushing the boundaries of what language can do. And sometimes I took that too far, and these poems were like utterly incomprehensible to anybody but me. And that's something that I've spent the last, God, I guess it's been 7 years now since I finished. That's something that I've been trying to like find the middle ground of like being accessible, inviting the reader into a piece versus like basically kind of showing off and being like, look how smart I am with my syntax. You know what I mean? So yeah, I kind of had to grow out of, that phase too, and start to merge these skills of like, I want to write things that people connect with, because that was what gave me so much life when I found poetry. And even before that, like I'd always been a big reader, and it was like, these worlds were more home to me than my home was. Like I kind of couldn't wait. I couldn't wait to get out of my parents' house, and I couldn't wait to get out of my hometown. And it was just a pretty bleak place. And then when I, writing or reading rather was like my first respite, where I would just like lock myself in my room and read, or like literally spend hours a day in the woods outside my house with my book. And like, and then discovering poetry was kind of the next layer of that feeling of belonging and connection, and just being able to feel at home in this world, because I found the little corner of it where my ideas and my feelings were welcome. And
Mm.
so seeing myself as a writer start to develop into that person who's more invested in connecting with people and offering a sense of belonging to people who maybe don't feel like they belong, versus just kind of patting myself on the back being like, aren't I clever?
When it comes to poetry, though, what about it do you love?
Mm. I love how much you experience in a short amount of time.
Mm.
Like there are some poems that I feel like have the emotional scope of a novel, and they're doing it in, 14 lines. And to me, that's like astonishing. And I think sometimes, and I don't want to like nag on this kind of poetry too hard, because I love when people just like write little poems for fun. But there is a difference between a poem that somebody just sort of like writes down the first time and then never goes back to. And then there are these poems where like poets spend years on these things, and like, it takes up a page. And yet there's still so much work to be done. There's this kind of refinement that happens. in poetry that like a kind of platitude that like gets tossed around in the writing world, by poets at least, is that fiction is the right words in the right order, and poetry is the best words in the best order.
Ah.
And so I think there's something about like I don't even want to call it the economy of poetry because I try to avoid like peppering in capitalist words into into things into moments like this. But there is just something powerful about evoking a feeling and an experience without needing 300 pages.
Mm. So you mentioned that initially you thought that fiction was your thing, and then you found poetry. Do you still do fiction as well?
I do, yeah. I've come back to it recently. I started writing short stories again, probably like a year and a half ago. I just kind of gotten to this point where like I have such a huge body of work of poems that I don't want to say that I got bored. That's not quite the truth. It's more just like I felt kind of wrung out on that particular form and wanted to take a break from it.
Mm.
And yet I don't want to abandon my writing practice because just like any practice, like you do start to kind of lose things and get a little rusty. It's not that you can't gain those back. You absolutely can.
Mm.
But I think that like all of the writers that I admire talk about having a consistent practice, even if that changes shape, right? Like sometimes your practice can be writing like 100 words a day or something, or maybe it's allowing yourself to only write once a month, but you're still doing it in
Mm.
some like consistent form. So yeah, I went back to fiction. I kind of had these little fragments that I'd collected over the years of prose that I just wasn't sure what to do with. And I
Mhm.
kind of think of them as like spare parts. I'm like, they're around, you know, they might come in handy
Mhm.
someday, but I can't do anything with them right now because frankly, I'm not sure what they are
Mm.
and I'm not sure how they fit together.
Yeah.
Um, and then yeah, I found this like little fragment of kind of like a real life conversation that I had heard in my friend's house, and they were just talking about really mundane things. But there was something about it that just kind of like struck something in me, and I just wrote it down almost verbatim. And then I filed that away, and then I started writing this other story, and then I thought of that like little piece of conversation, and I was like, oh, that belongs in here. So then it just sort of started to grow from there, where I just like between these spare parts and then the new stuff that I was writing, I was
Mhm.
like, oh, and now I have a short story. How cool is that? And then I was lucky enough so I live in Boulder, Colorado, and there is a pretty good local art scene here. It's close enough to Denver too that there's like a lot of cross pollination. And through a friend of mine who also writes and does photography, I heard about a fellowship, not a fellowship, I'm sorry, a grant that a local nonprofit foundation that had largely, weirdly enough, done a lot of like environmental work and environmental activism. They had generated some funding and wanted to kind of transition into funding local
Mm.
artists. And so I submitted a proposal for a novel because nobody wants to buy poetry. It's just a fact. Like if you write poetry, like you're not in it for the money. And you know, fiction. I'm just at a point in my writing life where, yeah, I don't need my writing to support me financially in its entirety, but it is nice to be rewarded for
Yep.
the things that you're making.
Mhm.
So I submitted my proposal for this novel, and they liked it. They accepted the proposal, and they gave me a grant. So I was able to, for the most part, live and work as a writer again
Wow.
for about a year. And I wrote a first draft of a novel, and it still needs a lot of work. There are definitely some flimsy parts because I just sort of had this like, since it's just a grant, there's no like publication that's guaranteed or required on the end of it. It's just funding
Mhm.
for the project. So, you know, technically I could have not finished the first draft and it would have been fine, you know, as long as I had a substantial body of work to like submit to the foundation as like proof that like, hey, you
I
didn't
did this
waste your
thing.
money.
Yep.
Yeah. but like as far as like the parameters were pretty flexible, but for me I really wanted to like have that deadline of a year of like I want a working first draft by this time.
Mm.
So there was definitely a moment in time where I just was trying to meet that deadline and like was just kind of like very much just getting things down,
Mm.
whereas prior, like there had been moments where like things were just so meticulous and carefully crafted and I was like editing as I was going.
Mm.
And then there's just this back half of the book where I had just gotten to this point where I had like written myself to a certain point and I was like, okay, I know where I'm headed. And so I wrote that part. And then there's this middle part where I'm trying to get from that point to the other. And
Mm.
I just had to kind of stitch it together.
Mm-hmm.
And now I need to go back and kind of like, like instead, like I need to take away the scaffolding and like, you know, continue building the thing.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
So yeah, it's been, yeah, the
So,
last 2 years have been more prose.
will it be? I mean, is it gonna be something you will go back to soon, or you're just taking time away from it?
Yeah, so I finished the first draft in at the beginning of April. So I've been taking a little break from it since then. And my summer tends to be a time where I'm like just busier and more active in my life. Like, you know, you can be outside a lot, and I really try to soak that up. And I'm definitely more social in the summer. And so there's just like other things that I needed to worry about. And once the grant funding ended too, like I had the very real question of like, okay, so how do I make money again? And that became more the primary focus of the last couple months. And then
Mm.
now I'm kind of like, I'm finding some stability on that front. And so I imagine I'll go back to it very soon. I have a bunch of voice memos of like ideas of like those parts that I know really need work. So like in a way, it's like always with me and I'm always kind of thinking about it. And I'm
Mm.
leaving myself this like trail of breadcrumbs so that when I go back to working on it intensely, like I have some stuff to work with because I had just gotten to this point where I'm like, and I don't know what else to do. And living, you know, in kind of gesturing back towards something I said before, like living life does tend to be really good fuel for writing and like all art, right? Like it just, you know, I'm meeting new people, I'm having different sorts of conversations, and a lot of the themes of the book, because it's stuff that I'm thinking about. It's like there's probably a name for this phenomenon, but like when you notice something for the first time and then you notice it everywhere, that's kind of how I feel about the book, where it's like I've just had these themes that I'm working on and these conversations I've been wanting to
Mm.
have, and then I'm just like hearing it everywhere, like hearing other people talk about these things and like seeing it play out in the world, and I'm just like, oh, like pull out my phone, voice memo time.
Okay, so we talked about your writing. The other part I thought is about the king. How did that start for you?
Yeah. So I've had a kinky side for as long as I can remember. I think that first expressed itself as a kind of exhibitionism. Like I just really loved being looked at, and really loved like exposing my body and having that be witnessed. And that, you know, I would say like in my teenage years, I was more in touch with that. And then in that relationship I mentioned, that was like not particularly good for me. One of the things that kind of demanded of me was that I like weirdly enough, maybe not weirdly, some people just aren't kinky. Like that side of me was like not okay in that relationship where like
Mm.
I don't know if it felt, again, like I have a feeling that this person was like really intimidated by like feminine power and like felt I don't know, just uneasy around those moments where I would express that part of myself, or
Mm.
like, you know, I really liked like dressing up in lingerie, and like I would like literally do that and then, you know, kind of plan this whole scene, and then he would come home, and maybe I should have talked to him about it in advance. Maybe things would have gone differently. But like, you know, I would invite him into these scenes that were like pretty tame, you know, like nothing super kinky yet. And he would always just kind of be like, I don't know what to do with this. And like, I would always be kind of crushed because I'm just like, isn't this like every guy's fantasy? Like, you're coming home to your hot girlfriend in lingerie. What's your deal? But like, you know, there's all kinds of things to unpack in what I just said.
Right,
And, you
right,
know,
right.
again, like, you know, there definitely could have been more forthright conversations about that. But anyway, so during that period of my time, I would say like the kink got like kind of like condensed and contained, and I kind of had to put it away. And then during that time in grad school, through some connections that I made and a relationship that I had for like a little over a year, he's actually who turned me on to FetLife. And that would have been like 2013. And it was just wonderful to like suddenly be exposed to this community of people. And like, you know how sometimes you don't recognize things in yourself until you see it in other people. And so there was just like a lot of permission that I got from the space in FetLife. And I wasn't super active. I was definitely more of a voyeur. I was kind of too scared to like participate a lot. And then again, like, you know, it was like the kink was showing up in my relationships, but it was very much contained to my like my dating life. And I started more actively seeking out partners who were at least interested in kink. And then I would say only in the last 2 or 3 years, like right before COVID, is when I started really kind of like giving myself permission to be like, no, this is part of me, and I refuse to be ashamed. You know, like I'm so tired of living in a shame-based culture. I'm so tired of hearing all those voices in my head that aren't mine telling me that I'm not supposed to be a certain way, or that this is inappropriate, or like whatever. And so I just decided that like I was old enough and knew myself enough that like I was coming from a thoughtful place and wanting to post on FetLife, and, you know, understanding the risks I was taking, and, you know, like feeling like I was well equipped for like navigating what may or may not come up as a result of me posting myself online, because, you know, like I post my face, you know, I like, that's not something that's lost on me. You know, my thinking around that is like, I have tattoos, like I'm infinitely identifiable, you know, especially my big back piece, you know, like that gives me away instantly. But yeah, I just, I've only recently taken kink out of the bedroom and started to like, you know, be more like fully embodied as like, this is who I am in the world too. Like, you know, I don't advertise, you know, these things to like just everybody, right? Like, you know, I understand that there's still, again, like a risk to like, oh, I lost my light. I'm turning that back on. Sorry. You know, again, I'm careful with who I share this part of myself with, but I would say that even, you know, whereas before, even in my intimate circles, I was sort of like, I don't want them to know I'm a kinkster, you know, like, and I'm hanging out with a lot of queer people who are like really accepting and like totally would have been like, hey, me too, or like, hey, cool. And I still just had all this internalized shame. And then, yeah, in the last 3 years, I've just been like, you know what, like, I'm going to face that shame. I'm going to reclaim part of myself and not let myself be limited by other people's judgments and criticisms, especially when what I'm doing is consensual and safe and, you know, and like, I think really beautiful. Just like the intimacy and the, like, I've had some of the best conversations around sex and sexuality that are so nuanced and lovely in the kink community. Whereas like, hearing like more normative conversations around sexuality, at least in the States, it's just very constricted and very, again, like shame based and I think really damaging to people who are, who just don't fit inside those lines necessarily. So yeah, like my kinky side has been with me for as long as I can remember, but I'm only now willing to like really step into that and be
What are
like,
some things
no.
that led to that acceptance?
I would say going back to FET, because like I was interested in it in like 2013 to like 2015, and then I had like, I think about it as like my vagabond wandery years. Like I was just really unrooted and just sort of like, exploratory and like moved around a lot and didn't really participate in the internet a lot. I don't know how else to say that. Like, I just, like, I'm not on Facebook. I only briefly had an Instagram as a way of connecting with people in Boulder when I first moved here, but I don't have that anymore. I've never been on Twitter. Like, I'm just not on them. And so, there was just a period of time where I was just kind of like cocooning And then, as I've been like emerging as this like transformed person,
Mm.
it's just like I have found people who nurture that. And I had a relationship during the pandemic where he was connected to a kink community, where like he had friends out in Washington State who like ran one of the BDSM camps in Burning Man, and he had gone to Burning Man a lot and had this like whole community of Kinksters that he kept in touch with.
Mm.
And that started to give me permission of like, oh right, like and because I had gone to back to FET for this as well, where like it was kind of one of those like hilariously simple moments of like, oh, it's not just like online that I can find these people, right? Like Kinksters are everywhere, and
Mhm.
I can, and obviously like COVID made this like not possible on the front end, but just having that seed planted of like, oh, there's a kink community in Denver, there's a kink community in Boulder, like there are
Mm.
people in real life I can connect with. And that's really important for me. Like I really need that like physical in-person connection and the energy exchange.
Mm.
And so I started just right before lockdown. I had gone to a couple like TNG Boulder events and like meetups, and like was starting to kind of like make plans for like gangbangs and stuff like that, like stuff I've always wanted to do, and like I was just like so excited. And then COVID hit, so
Yeah.
obviously everything kind of got locked down. But I was still with my partner, my ex-partner at the time, who we had a kink dynamic, and we would plan out scenes, and it was really fun to start to like, you know, he was really the first partner that I had that had like more experience in like
Mm.
actually embodying kink. Um, and then, he wasn't super open publicly. Like he kind of had his own stuff to work out on that front. Like he really only felt safe in like his like Burning Man community, for example.
Mm.
And then when that relationship ended, uh, part of the interesting thing about that relationship was that despite him being a kinkster, there was still something about my exhibitionism that was like a little threatening. And like everybody's got their limits, everybody's got their boundaries. So it was one of the ways that we weren't compatible, even if I could like empathize with where he was coming from.
Mm.
And then once that relationship ended, I just like dove hard into FET and was just I am ready to own that I want strangers to see me naked. And I'm ready to own that I love like embodying myself. And this is a way that I do that, that like I am a hypersexual person. Like I think we're kind of deluding ourselves about how much sex takes up our lives, and kind of governs things in this weird, like sort of like unseen way. And I think, there's also something about like stepping into that space as a woman. And like, I think of the
Mm.
content that I create, like I really want to be empowering to women, like even if it's not in this like explicit way, like I want to suggest through my own willingness to embody myself that like
Mm.
there is space for you in the world as a woman, and you can be safe, and you can have these like nuanced, complex, relationships with power and submissiveness that don't make you a bad feminist. And like you can make porn and not be a bad feminist.
Mm.
So yeah, that's, I feel like I went off on a tangent there,
No, no,
but
no, 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 no. You touched on something now. So COVID happened, shut everything down. You couldn't do some of the things you wanted to do, but talk about creating content. Something that really happened a lot was a lot of people were going online to start sex work, like creating content online. What like is that something you're considering, and what did you think of that?
yeah, I mean, I totally get it. And I got laid off immediately when lockdown happened. I was working in service industry, and the restaurant I was working for shut down indefinitely. And I had begun posting on FET, and I did this post kind of like just like asking for support, like if anybody, like kind of calling for support of everybody who got laid off, and kind of gesturing towards like those of you who are able to work remote and are like in these frankly like cushy tech jobs, like maybe you can kind of step into this place of like, for those of us that don't have that opportunity, offering some community support, especially like
Mm.
through the lens of FET, right? Like we're all here, it's a self-selecting group.
Mm.
um And so like I sold a couple of nudes and like nothing big. I've always been sort of intimidated on using other platforms and like not really knowing where to start. Like I've
Mm.
thought about, I end up talking myself out of it a lot, where I'm just like, I should cam, I think I'd love it. And then I'm like, but I don't know where to get started, and what site do I use, and like how much do you actually get paid, and is it worth my time? And yeah, like I totally get why a lot of people went to content creating in that moment of like, you're sort of being denied like your traditional ways of living, and also like frankly like sick of being paid so little. So like
Mm.
if you have an opportunity to maybe have more autonomy and sort of like the paradox of more dignity as a result of that autonomy,
Mm.
through camming or through, sex work or whatever it might be. Like I have so much empathy and understanding for that, and I definitely think about it, like, especially, seeing my numbers grow on FET. Like it's been astonishing to me, where I'm like, oh my God, like I never thought in a million years I would have 1,000 followers on any social media. And now like I just broke 6,000 yesterday. And I'm just like, this is bananas. Sentences I never thought I'd say.
Mm.
And so, seeing the way that people are responding to me is giving me a lot more courage. Like I'm actually chatting with somebody who does cam work in Denver, who's graciously kind of offering a little bit of guidance and mentorship, just like things they wish they'd known when they started, and like
Mm.
how to use some of these platforms and like really make the lifestyle work for you. So yeah, I'm increasingly interested in being more on paid platforms, and like I have some hesitance about that for like, it started like all of this started as something I was largely doing for fun and as a way of like owning myself. And I worry about like the transition from like free content to then asking
Mm.
people to pay, like there is a phenomenon where
Because
people.
then, like, there's this expectation.
Yeah, and like I feel like there's like the expectation of like, well, you were giving it away free for before, like, how dare you charge me now?
Mm.
And I think there is sometimes like a sense of entitlement once you've been given something, and then suddenly you're being asked to like, I think about like OnlyFans, I think about like ChatterBait, and like, just kind of thinking about like, what platform would I use if I wanted to do this, and what would be fair to people who want to see me, and yet also fair to me, because like I'm investing increasingly a lot of time and energy into this, and I do think of it as like one of my artistic endeavors. And I would love to, again, like I don't need to live on it exclusively, but if it allows me some stability and space to then keep creating content, like I feel like it's a win-win for everybody who's like
Mm.
interested in seeing my stuff. But it's been hard for me to like I just don't even know where to start, which is why I'm like this person in Denver who's like mentoring me. I'm like,
Well, yeah, you have the mentor, right?
yeah, yeah. And we just started chatting. They actually reached out to me. They've been doing cam work for years, and just like they were just really affirming of the content that I was making, and like, you should think about camming. I think you'd really like it. Like we can even do scenes together, because they're fairly successful. They're doing great. So they're able to live off what they're making comfortably.
Mm.
And again, like I don't have that expectation. I think there's something about being a writer and being used to a lot of rejection and like not making any money off poetry, where I'm just like, I don't want to feel like the world owes me
Mm.
this money for this content that I'm making. But if the universe wants to give me the gift of like sustaining me energetically from this thing that I'm already putting out there, that would be
Mm.
cool, like that. Like I think that there's like some, again, like I'm looking to reclaim some dignity through all of this. And it's like I think it's really funny that how I'm doing that is through porn and like willfully objectifying myself. But I
Mm.
do think that there's like really a lot of power in that. And I've been thinking like I want to do a lot of research into the history of porn, because I'm starting to get really interested in this designation of like, like why is it porn and not art? Like this is one of those questions that I feel like, so, like a lot of people have asked, and I bet you there's like great literature and research and conversations out there.
Mm.
And I'm just starting to ask that question for myself of like, yeah, why isn't pornography art?
Yeah, I think it's that. I remember there's actually this lady that made a film. It isn't it's not a documentary, it's fiction, but it's kind of based on a real story. I can't remember what the thing is, but it's about I can't remember the title of the film, but it's about porn in like in the valley in California or something. And it played at some pretty neat festivals. I'll try and find the name and send it to you.
Yeah, I would love that. Yeah, because like I did some like when I was starting to dabble in all of this, like I was curious about like my safety in a legal sense. So I did like the legal research of like what is as far as I can go with sex work while still being legal. And technically, under the law, pornography is art, and that's why we can distribute it. That's why it's not illegal, like to do cam work and things like that. Like visual media and things like that is all protected because it is art in that sense. But I'm interested in like this conversation in the public sense where like, if you were to ask, I feel like if we were to take a poll of random people on the street, I feel like most people would be like, no, porn is porn, not art. Porn is porn. And I'm like, well, yeah, sure. But can we like maybe broaden the conversation a little bit as to like, why do we make that designation? Like
Mm,
why is, and I feel like a lot of this is, definitely changing, but like I can think of a couple people in my life who, when these conversation comes up, like women, and the two people I'm thinking of are women, and I get their fear around pornography because it has been exploitative and it has been dangerous to women, and like, there's not always a lot of like protection or like recourse if you feel like violated doing a scene,
mhm,
because of its fringiness. But I feel like that will like that kind of stuff perpetuates through a culture of silence and shame. So if we can normalize some of these things and be like, no, like this is real work, this is a profession, this is creativity, and it can be safe and empowering for women. I just think that like maybe then we would think of it more as like an artistic endeavor, and like these people who are so afraid of it. I don't know. I wonder about the fear around these things. Like, is it like, I don't know. Are we like corrupting people? It's like, no, like you're all here because someone had sex, I don't know. Like all of these conversations are so interesting to
Oh
me.
man, it's always interesting chance with you, and I'm like, just want to keep it going, but I'm gonna let you go. However,
Yeah,
before I
sure.
do that, I'm gonna ask this last question.
Totally.
To you, what is something you think people misunderstand where kink is involved?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. And I think there's a sense that like you get involved with kink because you're somehow damaged or you've got trauma you're trying to work out, or kink is just a sneaky way that people like work out their shit in these unconscious ways, and that like somehow it's not consensual. But I think the kink community is like the best example of where nuanced and beautiful conversations around consent happen.
Mm,
And I think the way like everybody's got trauma, so I feel like you can throw that argument out the window. Like plenty of people have trauma, and it's not unique to kink, it's not unique to vanilla life. Like everybody experiences stuff.
mm,
But I think what makes kink different in that regard is that through these wonderful conversations around consent and how negotiations and contracts are such a part of this, like boundaries get drawn that are really healthy, and people can play with those boundaries in a way that
mm,
can be really healing. And it can be this reclamation. Like, I definitely am coming at it from that place.
mm,
And I think that that's something a lot of Kinksters share, is that there's like some shadow side that we don't want to be afraid of. We want to be able
mm,
to engage with it in a way that that shadow doesn't then control us because we're in conversation with it.
mm,
And to do that through connecting with other people is also like this beautiful transformative process of like you're being witnessed, you're being seen, and you're also witnessing and seeing other people, and you're really nurturing vulnerability. And like I feel like it does a really good job of like, kink is not just about power. It is also about vulnerability and the relationship between these things. And they're like,
Mm,
it does a good job of like exploring the ways that it's two sides of the same coin.
mm, mm. Wow, Lila, this has been super enlightening, and I can't wait to read your book when it's finally done.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
And I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing, being super open and vulnerable, and also thanks for coming to the sanctuary today.
Of course, this has been really fun. Thank you so much.